Let's talk about affirmative action. I'll get right down to it. Affirmative action hurts Asian people. The evidence is concrete. But proponents of affirmative action do not want to acknowledge this truth because they know that if society starts acknowledging this truth on a wide scale basis, some people may reach the conclusion that there is something perverse about a policy whose underlying rationale is about remedying harm that in practice acts to harm another. And here's my honest opinion, I have no idea what to do with this situation. Because affirmative action is intended to do good, and does do some good. But my opinion is that proponents of this policy do not want to acknowledge its harmful side, because they think it'll hurt their case. But regardless of that, there are things that need to be said for this discussion to be fair to Asian people. So let's go over some important points one by one. Firstly, race is the determining factor in college admissions, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. And I'll explain to you why that's important. Those who are defending affirmative action in the court of law, including colleges, powerful organizations like the ACLU, and currently the United States government, are lying by arguing otherwise. Here's what they say. They say that admissions process is holistic. Race is considered as one of many factors, and that each applicant is viewed individually on the strength of their applications. And the reason why they argue in those terms is because of the Supreme Court precedent, Grutter, that held that race-conscious admissions policies do not violate the Constitution if race is used as one factor among many, whereas if race were to be the only factor, that would presumably violate the equal protection of the laws. So let's explore how the Grutter decision, despite the fact that it was well-meaning, led to an outcome that directly contradicted the Supreme Court's vision for the role of race in college admissions. It turned out that race became the determining factor in a significant portion of college decisions. One small point to go over is that the court said that race can be used as a plus factor, but not a minus factor. This doesn't make sense, because college admissions is a zero-sum game. There's a limited number of offers colleges can make. Wherever there are multiple parties vying for a limited resource, an advantage for one side necessarily equates into a disadvantage for the other side, like cutting a cake. When you cut a bigger piece for one party, that necessarily means that the other party gets a smaller piece. That's the zero-sum game. If race is used as a plus factor for certain groups, that automatically translates into a minus factor for groups to whom this plus factor is not bestowed when the matter involves competing for limited spots. So the idea that race can be used as a plus factor but not a minus factor is paradoxical. But more to the point, here's how race is the determining factor in many cases. For any given college in any given year, the quality of their admissions pool looks like a bell curve. There are some on the either ends who are so obviously qualified and so obviously not qualified as measured against that standard of that specific college. Qualification encompassing everything that colleges look for in admissions: academic credentials, extracurriculars, and essays. But by and large, most people fall within the middle range. And it is within this middle range where colleges have the most leeway in deciding whether to offer applicants an admission. So let's first look at where race is not the determining factor. It is not a determining factor at the either ends of the bell curve. If your application profile is within the top 1% of the applications to that school, you're getting admitted, whether you're white, black, Asian, or Hispanic, or whether it's Harvard or your local state school. Conversely, if the quality of your application is at the bottom rung, and that can mean different things. You had terrible grades, or you had good grades, but your personal essay clearly reflected poor character. If you're at the bottom rung of the pool, you're not getting in, regardless of your race. But in the middle, which is where most applicants of all races are, and where colleges have the most leeway in making admissions decisions, race becomes the determining factor in many cases. And this can be measured by probability. Everyone knows that if you fall within this middle range, your chance of acceptance can vary significantly depending on your race. In fact, there are websites that use the historical data of college admissions to gauge your chance of acceptance at a given school. And you can plug in the stats, your GPA, your SATs, and it asks you for one more thing, your race. And if you put in your stats and play around only with the third category, you see a phenomenal difference in the likelihood of acceptance. If, as a member of one race, you have a high chance of acceptance based on an application profile within the middle range of the bell curve, let's say hypothetically 3.7 GPA, 1450s SATs, run-of-the-mill extracurriculars, and if that exact profile were to belong to a member of another race, the same would give the latter a low chance of being admitted. How can you argue that race is not the determining factor? Of course, you can try to muddle it up with some gobbledygook and say, oh, they consider essays and personal history and blah blah. But the cases where personal history or your essay makes a material difference are outlier cases. When you have some phenomenal story, you've overcome an extremely rare and extraordinary difficulty in your life, or you won the Nobel Peace Prize. For the vast majority of the applicants, when you boil down to it, your academic credentials is the most important factor, and whether your academic credentials are considered up to par with the college's standard varies significantly depending on your race, i.e., race is the determining factor. Putting the consequences of this fact in different numbers, according to a Princeton study, Asian applicants have to score 140 points higher in the SATs than white applicants and 450 points higher in SATs than black students to get into the same school. In fact, see the stats in any competitive schools, Asians have to get far higher SATs, higher GPA than any other race to get into the same school. So why is it important to acknowledge that race is the determining factor in many cases? I believe a lot of people don't have to think about the ugly side of affirmative action because it's cushioned around palatable language, that the admissions process is holistic, race is one factor considered among many. But people need to know that this is not the whole truth, that race is in fact the determining factor in many cases. People need to know because this fact drives home the ugly side of affirmative action, that it disadvantages Asian kids. If you're an Asian kid and your grades are average relative to your white, black, or Hispanic peers, most likely you're not getting in. If you, as an Asian kid who did not get in, would have been more likely to get in on those same stats were you to be white, or far more likely to get in if you were to be black or Hispanic, that means you didn't get in because you're Asian. Race was the determining factor. This is the ugly truth that society is not facing up to. Asian parents feeling the need to hire the services of agencies who specialize in concealing the Asian identity of their kids in their application, that's ugly. Happening in 2022. But more to the point, let's talk more specifically on how affirmative action is hurting Asian people in practice. And yes, I'm talking about the Harvard case, right now before the Supreme Court. This suit alleges that Harvard is discriminating against Asian applicants over white applicants, but this suit is a collateral attack on affirmative action or race-conscious admissions, which is why proponents of affirmative action are defending Harvard in court. In this case, Harvard purposefully graded Asians lower on personality traits than any other race to artificially depress the number of Asian students being admitted to their schools. They're denying it, but I'll tell you why I think they did this on purpose. During trial in the lower court, Harvard fought tooth and nail to be able to keep their admissions data hidden during the discovery process. And no wonder why, because it revealed some ugly facts. Harvard graded Asian applicants as a whole lower on personality traits like integrity, likability, and courageousness than any other race. Black applicants as a group received the best personality ratings, followed by Hispanic, then white, then Asian. So how did this happen? There are two plausible inferences here, one innocent and one invidious, that either this was not done on purpose or that it was done on purpose. So why do I believe the latter? So the first plausible inference is that there was an innocent explanation behind the result, that this was not done on purpose. Perhaps it was the result of subconscious bias, if that is a thing, by the admissions officers of Harvard. But because of the order of the ranking, to hold that as an explanation, it would also necessarily encompass a finding that Harvard admissions officers held racial bias against white students over black and Hispanic students, something I don't think that Harvard wants to argue. So what about another innocent explanation? This is the result, because for whatever reason, this result accurately reflects the personalities of the respective pools of applicants. It may be the case, again for whatever reason, that as a group, black applicants to Harvard do actually have the best personality, followed by Hispanic students, followed by white, then Asian. And thus, this result is an accurate reflection of how things are. And here I want to caution against people immediately jumping to the conclusion that this would be racist. As I've explained in my stereotype and group characteristics video, there are real intergroup differences in attitude, behavior, and culture, and that not all, but enough people within a given group do conform to the group stereotype, an accurate reiteration of group characteristics, so as to produce a group-like outcome consistent therewith. So if it is really the case that Asians, as a group, have a smaller portion of applicants that possess the personality traits that Harvard is looking for, then the result is innocent. Harvard didn't do anything wrong. But when we look at it within context, it becomes clear that the second plausible inference, that Harvard did this on purpose, is the correct one. And let me make it clear what I mean by context. You will never find direct evidence of racial discrimination in this case or cases like it. You'll never find a document, for example, that the Chancellor of Harvard directed admissions officers to rank Asians lower on personality traits, because they're not stupid enough to do that. And the Supreme Court has acknowledged this in cases like Arlington Heights, and held that in looking at the whole of the circumstances, circumstantial evidence is enough to prove discriminatory purpose, because proving racial discrimination by such direct evidence, like a document stating an intent to discriminate, or Harvard admitting in court they did this on purpose, is a practical impossibility, even where discriminatory intent exists. So let's look at the context and see what the surrounding circumstances tell us. First thing to look at is the difference between personality grading done between admissions officers and alumni interviewers. Alumni interviewers, who grade a small portion of Harvard's applications, after meeting these candidates face to face, in effect grade Asians as good on personality traits as any other race. This is as opposed to those admissions officers who grade personality scores despite having never met these candidates. It could be the case that this difference is perhaps because the alumni interviewers didn't hold the subconscious bias that the admissions officers held. On the other hand, this would be the natural result if Harvard was doing this on purpose. If they were, they wouldn't direct alumni interviewers who only grade a small portion of Harvard's application pool and thus have a small impact anyways, to systematically grade Asians lower. There would be too great a likelihood that this practice would be exposed if alumni interviewers who are not employees of Harvard were to be let in on it. Either way, this tends to make less probable the truthfulness of the second innocent explanation that this disparity in personality grading is the result of an accurate reflection of the way things are. But more importantly, take a look at the rank of this personality trait grading and examine it in the context of Harvard's admissions process as a whole. Harvard has three main criteria by which they assess an applicant's chance for admission: academic achievements, including GPA and SATs, extracurricular activity, and personality scores. The assessment of the first two, academic achievements and extracurricular activity, is based on objective criteria, whereas the third, personality grading, is subjective. So let's take a look at the ranking by race of this third category. As a group, Black applicants got the best personality scores, Hispanic second, White third, and Asian fourth. But take a look at the rank under the two objective criteria, academic achievements and extracurricular activity. Under both criteria, Asians as a group performed the best, White second, Hispanic third, and Black fourth. The order in which the racial groups were graded on personality traits is inversely correlated with the order in which the racial groups performed on the objective criteria. Do you expect us to believe that this is a coincidence? Or is Harvard using the subjective personality grading, something that is fully within their control, unlike the first two, as a counterweight to the other two criteria? They're not using these personality grades to assess an individual's character and thus chance for admission, but rather as a tool to engage in racial balancing and implement the sought racial quota. In other words, Harvard has too many Asian applicants that fit their acceptance profile under the objective criteria, and Harvard has not enough Black applicants that fit their acceptance profile under that same criteria that they need to achieve the balance of racial demographics in the incoming class it desires. But it would be too on the nose for them to implement a system that says, okay, for a candidate whose GPA is 3.8 and SATs 1550s with the run-of-the-mill extracurriculars, you're in if you're Black, you're out if you're Asian. Not only would that be too on the nose, it is also banned by the Supreme Court, because race would so obviously be the determining factor. So what they're doing instead is they're using this third subjective criteria, personality grades, to serve as the counterweight to the objective criteria, so that they have the necessary justifications to engage in racial balancing to achieve the racial demographics they want to achieve. And the practical impact of that is that, number one, it yields the same results that an on-the-nose system would have yielded. Race becomes the determining factor for candidates within a certain range of GPA SATs, and whose extracurriculars are not something beyond the ordinary. And number two, as a result of their attempt at racial balancing, Asians are being systematically graded lower on personality traits in order to artificially depress the number of our students being admitted. This is racism, and I'm offended that our society is not more offended by it. Harvard has a good proportion of students who are Asian, but let me make this clear. They got in despite this discrimination. If Harvard could not systematically grade Asians lower on personality traits in order to artificially depress the number of our young students, there would have been more. Harvard is giving our young students lower grades on personality traits on purpose so that they can admit less of us, to make room for other groups. Do the ends justify the means? Do you honestly expect Asian people to be okay with being subject to this racist practice because Harvard has to find some way to make room for other racial minorities? If you get down to it, affirmative action harms Asian students. It is not within our interest. And before I go into my personal opinion on what to do about this situation, let me get you to consider two more things. Number one, is Harvard the only school engaged in this sort of racist behavior? Or is a practice identical or similar to this going on in all the competitive schools, seeing as how the gap between what Asian applicants have to achieve and what white students have to achieve to get in, or the wider gap between Asian applicants and Black and Hispanic applicants is observed in all these schools? Should someone bring a lawsuit to find out? And the other thing I want you to think carefully about is, how would you think society would have reacted if it was found that Harvard was grading Black students as a group lower on personality traits than any other race, for whatever reason, innocent or invidious? Would we have to even do this analysis of the debates of the plausible inferences? Would Harvard's lawyers dare to rationalize this act before the Supreme Court? Or would our society be immediately engulfed in uproar? Would Harvard students line their campus in protest? Would heads be rolling at the top echelons of Harvard's leadership? And would Harvard have to put out a groveling apology and a promise to change? This is the difference between their political power and ours. We don't have it, they do. So here's where I talk about my personal opinion. But just to be clear, that affirmative action harms Asian students is a fact, not my opinion. Affirmative action, or race-conscious admissions, has yielded a system in which Asian students have to achieve higher grades, higher test scores, and engage in a wider breadth of extracurricular activities than white students, and to a wider degree than Black and Hispanic students. It has also yielded a system in which colleges are employing racist tactics, like rating us lower on personality traits, to achieve this result. Affirmative action hurts Asian students. But here's the thing. If we're going to be fair in our dealings with other communities, we cannot expect everything to be tailored to our interests. Because we live in a multiracial society, there are other communities to consider. And our conversations instead should be driven by notions of fairness to all parties involved. And my opinion is that there is some good to affirmative action, and it was meant to do good. Diversity of faces is a good. Classrooms in higher education should have diverse faces. And diversity of faces roughly translates into diversity of opinion, although there's some real question about whether diversity of opinion is actually being allowed on college campuses by these diverse faces. And I honestly don't know whether there is a workable alternative that can guarantee diversity without making it more difficult for Asian kids to get into schools. We cannot expect everything to be tailored to our interests, but at the same time, we have a right to be heard when something is so obviously against our interest. The problem that the Asian community is experiencing isn't that we're fighting too much for ourselves, rather it's the opposite. We're not fighting enough for ourselves. Part of the conversation on affirmative action should be the impact it has on Asian kids. But that's not part of the conversation among the proponents of affirmative action. They don't want to acknowledge it. When this truth about Harvard came out, it was one of those times when I realized, wow, this society gives no two damn about Asian people. We have to start fighting for ourselves. Because when the news of this issue broke out, everyone who was defending affirmative action was silent about Harvard's conduct. Members of the media, politicians, activists, and yes, some of our own people did not want to put too huge a spotlight on this issue because it was undoubtedly linked to race-conscious admissions. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the most prominent Asian-led organization, is out there defending Harvard, defending affirmative action, and they have nothing to say on behalf of our young people, the people for whom the organization was created. They did not condemn Harvard's conduct, because to do so would be a tacit admission that the system that yielded this result, affirmative action, harms Asian students. And they don't want to acknowledge that. So who are you really fighting for? Harvard's lawyer, when asked by the Supreme Court 4-5 times why Harvard is grading Asian students lower on personality traits, could not answer. Instead, filibustering by saying, oh, this is statistically insignificant. Race is considered as one of many factors. We don't really put too much weight onto the personality factor. Okay, then why did you do it? What they're all saying collectively is clear. Do not pay attention to this, even if this is grossly unjust to your kids. So let me tie all of this together. The reason why proponents of affirmative action want to spread the misinformation that race is never the determining factor, the reason why they don't want to acknowledge what Harvard did was wrong, is because they think it'll hurt their case. They don't want to acknowledge that affirmative action harms Asian people because it hurts their case. Regardless, that is the truth, and it should be up to people, after being given the chance to consider it, to make the decision for themselves whether that is a cost our young students should bear for the sake of diversity. That's not something for me to answer, that's something for our society to answer collectively. But people are not even having to face that question because it's not being acknowledged that this is the impact. And the reason why it's not being acknowledged is because if it were to be acknowledged, they know that a lot of people would reach the conclusion that no, actually, it's not acceptable. Particularly if the reason why you're saying affirmative action is needed is to remedy past discrimination, and it has the practical impact of hurting another group that has been discriminated in the past. But even if a lot of people reach that conclusion for themselves, that is their conclusion to make. It is not in the place of the proponents of affirmative action to muddy the water as to the truth so as to guide the conversation in a way favorable to them. We need to fight harder for ourselves because nobody else cares. That means making proponents of this policy face the evidence instead of dismissing it and face the reality of the impact, facing up to the bullying tactics. Oh, we're aligning with white supremacy, or we're exercising privilege because we're noticing that as a result of this policy, our students are being systematically graded lower on personality traits? Okay. So I suppose you want us to sit down and shut up and just take it. Nope. That also means having them face up to the inconsistencies of this policy. If the purpose of affirmative action is to remedy past harm so as to provide a level playing field, Why are you okay with the same system that makes it harder for Asian students to get in than white students? Asian people have been subject to discrimination in this country, so aren't you hopping mad that under this system, Asian students have to get better grades and test scores than the white students to get into the same school? If not, why aren't you mad? Yes, not everything has to be in our interest. But where something is against our interest, we have a right to say that it is and be heard, and have the impact be considered in the debate without being subject to bullying tactics. Here's the thing, nobody expects us to do anything other than zealously fight for our own. If they expect otherwise, they're not our friends. If they say your interest is always in following my interest, our interest must always be aligned under the bigger umbrella of my interest, they're not your friends. And the only reason why it's expected for Asian people to fight for things that are not in our interest is because they've gotten used to that. Because they have a cavalry of Asian people, the Bobo liberals, who are ready to serve as their servants, ready to go on TV and write op-ed pieces, talking down to other Asian people, decrying our own who want to fight for our interests as divisive or not acting in solidarity or aligning with white supremacy. They'll lie on television and say that Asians are the intended beneficiaries of affirmative action and point to some outlier case of the Asian refugee and not consider the impact it's having on the vast majority of the Asian people. In other words, they've gotten used to us being submissive and expect us to roll over. If more of us spoke out and forced this conversation into the public conscience and said, hey, look, whatever the benefit of affirmative action, this Harvard situation, for example, is unacceptable to us, then at least we would be heard. We'd be having a conversation that serves our young high school students to whom we owe a duty. Right now, the Asian applicants applying to Harvard are subject to this practice. They'll be graded lower on their personality traits so that this can serve as a counterweight to their academic achievements, and many of them will be rejected as a result. It is up to us, the adults in the room, to have the courage to speak up despite our lack of political power, go against the grain of the mainstream, and say no. You want to have a talk about affirmative action? Fine. Affirmative action does do some good. It promotes diversity. Yes, in that regard, it benefits us all. And yes, we live in a multiracial society. Not everything has to be in our interest. But if you're going to advocate for this policy, own up to the impact first. Start by acknowledging that affirmative action in practice harms Asian students, in that the practical impact is that it's harder for our kids to get into schools. Also, schools are employing discriminatory tactics like grading us lower on personality traits to achieve this result. When things like this are said, then we can have an honest conversation about whether this is a burden our young students should have to bear for the sake of diversity. Then, people can reach their own conclusion whether, in spite of this, affirmative action is justified. Do not expect us to ignore all this evidence just because it hurts your case. If it hurts your case, it hurts your case. If you expect us not only to ignore, but also to spread misinformation about what is happening to our kids so that you can make your case with greater ease, you are not our friend. So why should I listen to you? Look, I know that this is no easy task. Criticizing affirmative action could make you an outcast, a social pariah in many circles. It may jeopardize the things that you hold dear. But it's worth it, because our kids are counting on us. The more of us that stand up and stay united, the less each of us will have to bear the impact of the collateral consequences to our lives. The less they will have expectations that we will roll over and play dead. Just as our young students are counting on us, so too am I counting on us. Thank you for watching.